Which is worse, spiritual or physical danger? This is a question my very first counselor asked me during one of our initial sessions. I was 18, and I knew the answer without a thought. Spiritual danger is obviously worse. I grew up Mennonite. We have a book full of stories of our martyrs about this thick, with pictures. We know that having a good relationship with God is more important than being physically safe. Then, when I was 8 years old, Columbine happened. And most people associate Columbine with a tragic school shooting. What I remember is the Christian cultural phenomenon of She Said Yes, a book written with journal entries from a teenage girl who I was told was forced to choose between her physical safety or her spiritual safety when a shooter pointed a gun at her head and asked her if she believed in God. This story has since been debunked and clarified. But as I grew into adolescence, the question of whether I would profess my faith at gunpoint was something that I thought about all the time. I was a good Christian. My community taught me to value my spiritual safety over my physical safety as a default. And that's precisely why I was in my counselor's office in the first place. Because by 18, I had become so obsessed with having the perfect spiritual life that I could not function in everyday life. I was exhausted all the time from monitoring my thoughts, suppressing my feelings, trying to make sure that I did not stray from God's plan for my life. I was sleeping too much. I wasn't able to focus in my classes. And I had a really hard time trusting my new peers. But it was even harder to trust myself, because I had been raised to take every thought captive. And as I took every thought captive, examining whether it was going to get me closer to or further away from a good relationship with God, I didn't have time for much else. I was too busy being afraid of doing the wrong thing, thinking the wrong thing, feeling the wrong thing, being the wrong thing. It became so overwhelming that I wished that I could die, because that would just make it easier. And then I hated myself for having such a sinful thought. So this seems extreme. My friends at the time, I think, thought it was extreme and suggested I go see a counselor. My counselor probably thought it was extreme, which is why she asked the question, well, which is worse, spiritual or physical danger? And I would guess that some of you here would think that maybe that's a bit extreme. Maybe you have a different answer to the question my counselor asked me than I did when I was 18. About a decade later, I do, but it's not the answer that you'd expect. After years of recovery, which involved me understanding what was happening in my body, I came to know that spiritual danger and physical danger are not in a hierarchy. To a nervous system, they're the same thing. But before I go too deeply into why that is, I should probably explain a little bit more about spiritual danger, because not everybody grows up being afraid of spiritual danger. So, in order to do this, I need to give you some information about fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism is an approach to religion. And a few years before the Columbine shooting occurred, two psychologists decided that they wanted to come up with a psychological scale that they could use to measure fundamentalism in individuals. And it involved four main components. First, there is one ultimate truth, one right way to understand the world. Two, that truth is constantly under attack from evil forces out to destroy it. Three, that truth must be followed using practices and beliefs from the past. And four, the people who follow those practices and beliefs from the past get a special relationship with a deity or the creator of the truth. Fundamentalism requires 100% commitment to a set of beliefs and practices at all costs. At all costs. If you start to fall from that 100%, it is up to you to get yourself back up to 100 by revising your beliefs, reviewing scripture, talking to people who can convince you back into right belief and right action. Now, in some fundamentalist communities, it's okay to have doubt, as long as it's part of your journey back to the 100%. The moment you stop striving to return is the moment you're in spiritual danger, and the moment you become a spiritual danger to the group. Now, what does that even look like, though? What is spiritual danger? Well, it varies according to faith tradition, but often it involves violence in the afterlife. And that violence can look like anything from fire to torture to abandonment, and it's particularly scary because it's in the afterlife, so it doesn't end. It goes on forever. But stories about what happened to us after we die aren't really provable or disprovable at this point, and it doesn't matter. What matters is what a person believes, because our nervous systems have evolved not only to deal with immediate, perceived, obvious threats in the present, but also to perceived threat. And a thought system like fundamentalism primes a nervous system to perceive threat anytime someone falls away from the practices and beliefs that are required of them. And did you notice that the only difference between spiritual violence and physical violence that could happen to someone before they die is when it occurs? Fire, torture, abandonment, human bodies know about these things before death. And so as they prepare to avoid them in the future, there's not really a difference on a nervous system level. So spiritual violence, spiritual danger, which is often something that we think about in the distant future, can be processed by a body as if it is happening in the present moment. The fire, the torture, the abandonment, it might as well be now. And this is why spiritual and physical danger feel the same to a nervous system. Well, of course, it was not helping me to have a body preparing to avoid fire, torture, abandonment when I was in my first year of college, when none of those things were happening. The looping thoughts, the inability to focus in class, the sleeping too much, the getting so overwhelmed that I wanted to die, these are all signs of a nervous system in fight-flight, in overdrive. And recently, terms have been emerging to describe the specific experience I was having in college. Religious trauma. And it's more common than you might think. In fact, we live in a society full of people who have a fear of spiritual danger that is so intense that it is getting in the way of them being able to live their normal lives. A study in 2023 found that 1 in 3 people in the United States have experienced religious trauma. 1 in 3. And that could include any of these 6 symptoms: stress, fear, shame, anxiety, depression, and nightmares related to spending time in a rigid religious environment. But it's not guaranteed. Just like 2 people can emerge from the same car accident, 1 person with trauma and 1 person without. 2 people can spend time in a fundamentalist community. 1 can emerge with religious trauma and 1 may not. Everybody experiences their religious environment differently. So 1 person, because of neurodivergence or a belief-shattering life event or sexual orientation or any kind of difference, may not be able to maintain the beliefs and practices required of them to feel safe in their religious community. But other people can. They may never think of spiritual danger. They may never consider fire, torture, and abandonment because they can follow all the rules. It doesn't apply to them. In fact, fundamentalism may even benefit them. Studies vary, but some have shown that fundamentalism can benefit people who truly believe. It can lessen their stress. And that makes things really confusing when we don't have much awareness about religious trauma, because people with religious trauma interacting with people who benefit from their fundamentalism are going to be thrown into a communication gap. Because what one group of people experiences as resources, another group of people experiences as violent, harsh demands and threats. Come to this worship service with me, or you're in danger. Try this new prayer practice with me, or you're in danger. Have you read this new book? It really helped my beliefs. It might help yours, or you're in danger. Make it work, or you're in danger. So what do we do? Well, I think anyone who has experienced harm from fundamentalism to the point of religious trauma has every right to be wary of religion in general. And I come at this from a unique perspective because of how I dealt with my religious trauma. So first, I became an atheist on purpose. It took some work. And that was my way of getting spiritual danger off the table. But I didn't want to leave my community. So I became a pastor. Because I wanted to have some control over my personal religious experience. So between my first counseling session and my first sermon as a pastor, I had 7 years of religious education. And I loved it. I loved learning about how expansive religion can be, how there's so many more ways to approach it than fundamentalism. And in particular, I loved learning the roots of religion as a word, the etymological roots. Religion contains the Latin root religare. It means to bind. Now, anyone who's experienced religious trauma knows the violent bind to practices and beliefs that can strangle a person into compliance. But there are more ways to approach religion than that. In particular, I've come to love mysticism. Proponents of mysticism engage in spiritual practices in order to experience wholeness, to feel firsthand the oneness we are all already a part of just by sharing time in existence together. It's not about creating a bind as much as it is about observing the ways we are already bound together gently. I offer you this lens through which to approach religion as a way to maybe soften it a bit. Because there are some people whose faith traditions support them and nourish them. It helps them be the people that they want to be in the short time that they have on this earth. And there are other people who have been incredibly harmed by their faith traditions. And the best thing that they can do for their health is to release that bind. As for me, during my years as a pastor, my religious trauma reemerged, and I felt like I was 18 all over again, but this time with more responsibility. I loved my training. I learned a lot, but the organized religion available to me was not helping me heal. So I left. But I still keep in contact with family and friends who have so much nourishment coming to them from their faith traditions. And that's because I'm not a threat to them, and because they're not a threat to me. I am fortunate to be surrounded more by mystics than I am by fundamentalists. So if someone speaks to you of religious harm, believe them. Because physical danger and spiritual danger feel the same to a nervous system. And if you get a chance, look for the things that bind you beyond shared religious affiliation, shared beliefs and practices. You just might honor the heart of religion at its best. Thank you.